Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another Farmers Weekly Transition webinar. I'm Hugh Broom. I'm your host this evening. We've got an hour and a quarter of what I hope you will find really useful discussion. Normally, I host the Farmers Weekly podcast, but I'm here with you hosting this webinar. And this evening, as you will have appreciated from the title, which is why you logged on to join, we are discussing genetics and varietal choices, inbuilt traits for arable farmers. It's the snappy title. We are going to be talking all about varietal traits such as disease resistance, standing power, delayed early sowing, relationships to harvest date, simplifying management, the whole cacophony of resource related questions, which obviously ultimately could contribute towards you guys helping to reach net zero and seeing if we can talk about increasing yields at the same time. So there is a huge amount for us to talk about, talking about the development of varietal enhanced genetic properties, and again, how those can help to reduce carbon footprint, challenges of reduced agrochemical arsenal, because as we know, all these new approvals, they're a rare and special thing in the current era, and the percentage of your potential how much of your percentage or your potential yield is actually down to varietal choice, or is it actually about lots of other things as well? Now, clearly, I am just a simple beef farmer from Surrey, and I haven't got a Scooby about any of this, so I need an esteemed panel of people to help me. We have got on the line tonight, we've got Kirsty Richards, who is the Cereals Product Manager from KWS, Matthew Clark, who is an expert when it comes to oilseed rape plant variety developments from Bayer, and we've got Antonia Walker, who is an expert when it comes to root crops. I'm just going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. What I should say is that Kirsty, thanks to the firewall at KWS, she's unable to join us with a video, but she's there. She's there in the ether. And we'll go to Kirsty first. So Kirsty, on your audio only Eurovision Star Results link, can you please introduce yourself and tell us about what you do for KWS?
I can, Hugh. Thank you very much. And very sorry for the technical difficulties that KWS has caused everybody. But yes, so my name is Kirsty Richards, and I, as you said, am the wheat and barley product manager at KWS UK. So I've been with the business for around 20 years, and I sit in the unenviable position of sitting in between the breeding department and the commercial department. So looking at the products that are coming through the pipeline, thinking about how the portfolio can best suit farmers and the market that they are going into.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Matthew, would you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Clark. I'm a winter oilseed rape breeder, and I work for Bayer Crop Science. So I've had, I suppose, quite a long career in plant breeding of something like 43 years now. I began work at the old Plant Breeding Institute in Cambridge and worked for a few years on field beans, then on peas, and then about 25 years ago I moved on to this terrible oilseed rape crop that I've been suffering with ever since. So that's my story. Unfortunately, I've never worked on a cereal crop, so all your lovely questions on cereals, I'll tend to turn around into oilseed rape questions. So I hope that's okay.
Bit of crossover there. Thank you, Matthew. And Antonia, tell us about yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Antonia Walker. I basically am the technical specialist for root crops, basically sugar beet and potatoes, and also pulses and field veg. And I work for UPL Europe. Previously, my previous roles, I started off as an agronomist covering all crops. And basically, I've graduated up to the heady heights of potatoes and sugar beet over the years, which I thoroughly enjoy. So I basically support the UK team, and I'm responsible for the UPL portfolio, but also on the technical point of view, I also look after nationally sort of the UPL portfolio for other crops as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, what I should say is that there is on your window where you're watching the webcast, the webinar, you will see there is a chat screen. And any of you that are logged in, if you want to fire questions at our panel as we go along, please do. And just to, sort of reassure us that they're real people out there, please put your name and please put where you are and tell us a bit about what you're farming, and then put your question in there and we'll try and feed them to the panel as we go along. We've got a whole rake of questions which were pre-submitted as well, so we're going to get stuck in with those now. So one that's come up and has been asked quite a bit is really the questions around gene editing. Tim Donovan, his question says, when can we expect to see gene edited varieties entered into official trials? Now, we know there's potential change to the law coming. I'll start with you on this one, Kirsty. When are we actually going to see into trial, and when do you think we could see these products on the market?
Yeah, fabulous. So I think probably let's just kind of reaffirm what gene editing actually means. It's about obviously transferring a sort of a gene, and that may be at the base layer of DNA or chunks of whole genes, or from a species within the species. So it's not about going between species at all. That would be GMO. But gene editing really is what we do in standard breeding anyway. But the techniques we can use would actually help us do everything a lot quicker. And it may help us to look at other traits that we can't look at so well when we get really under the skin of the products that we're looking at and find out the actual genes involved in controlling things such as, I'm thinking bread making, for example. It could be looking at something like baking volume in a milling weeks. So I think it offers a real potential to look at things in a slightly different way and a quicker way. Now, from my understanding, the legislation at the moment is for England only, and I think that's important, and it's for research to be actually carried out. So I would imagine that academics are working on many things and that we'd probably have field material towards harvest, probably this, maybe next year. So I think it probably will be a few years until we get into official trials, and then obviously after official trials, getting a product onto the market. So I think a while, if I'm honest. I don't know whether it's the same in other crops, but I think with cereals, that's the case.
And Antonia, are you? I mean, can you clearly see there's areas within what the work you're doing, particularly with the root crops, where gene editing is going to play a part?
Yes, definitely. I think especially when it comes to being resistant to certain pests and diseases, for example, in sugar beet, there's work being done already in collaboration with the BBRO, looking at how you can actually use gene science to actually sort of overcome virus yellows. Also in potatoes, you've got sort of varieties that are being bred to actually be resistant to certain pests and diseases such as PCN or blight. So yeah, there's definitely a place for it.
That's it. And Matthew, do you see clear areas where you can utilise that tech in oilseed rape development?
Yeah, I mean, I see. I think that putting time in the question is quite interesting, really, because if you think about traditional GM technology, for example, it's quite one of the problems with it, apart from what we all know about the resistance to people not liking the idea and so on, because it's moving genes from one species to another. But one of the problems with that has always been also that it's quite a complicated procedure, and it takes a long while to actually transform a particular plant. Not all genotypes will transform very easily, so you have to put the gene into the genotype that will work and then spend years of breeding putting it back into something normal. So it's not a straightforward task. Whereas with gene editing, you've got the potential of starting off with maybe an existing variety, whatever species you might be talking about, and then thinking, oh, wouldn't it be good to put something in very quickly, maybe a trait we already know, and put it in very, very, very rapidly using gene editing, and then take that straight into the applications process. And having a few discussions with for example, some people who know a lot more about this than I do at places like JI, they think it's going to be much more amenable to do that and work with advanced material in the first place and use gene editing to put new traits in, or existing traits that would otherwise take a long while to move into commercial materials. So it really does present some good opportunities for moving things along quickly.
Absolutely. And Kirsty, tell us, I mean, you're stuck there between the development end of the business and the commercial end of the business, and you're trying to sort of, navigate what's the average timeline? So, your average wheat variety, how long does it take to get from concept to, farmers buying it in bags on farm?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long old process in truth. So typically we would make a number of crosses every year, which would probably produce around 3 million potential varieties each year of winter wheat, just as an example. And from that, we take the next 7 years to actually choose the ones that we wanted in terms of their yield or disease or standing characters, select them forward and take them through, and obviously purifying the variety as we go through the system. So after 7 years, we do finally get a variety, but then we obviously have to go into official testing, which is 2 years of national listing before we can sell a variety, and then obviously recommended list trials, and then onto the recommended list. So I think if you add all that up, that's about 13 years.
Yeah, it's a long process and a lot of investment. So anything that shortens that down will obviously help things. Let's move on. We've got another question from Claire Harold, which asks, I've been told that greater root mass on cereals is the way to improve soil health, structure and carbon sequestration. Is there any varietal knowledge or development on this in terms of looking and addressing the root mass? Kirsty, I'll throw that one straight back to you.
Yeah, so absolutely, Claire. We're learning more and more about how important, remembering, in fact, more importantly, how important soil health is and structure and preparing us for the future in terms of how we're producing our cereal crops and other crops too. We do know that rooting is very important, and I think really just refers back to your last question, Hugh, when you asked me about the numbers game. We would love, in an ideal world, to have a very sort of succinct system that could screen those 3 million potential varieties each year to look for the ones that had the best root structure. That technology just isn't there at the moment, and so it's a bit more of a numbers game. So certainly as breeders, we are spending time looking at root structures and doing work across with other organisations and academic institutions looking at root structures, but they are really looking at the structures of the varieties that are already on the marketplace, just because it's a numbers game. So we're getting good ideas. We're finding that certain varieties produce very different root structures to others, and we know that some, particularly when we look at milling wheat, that, the root structure is going to be very important for scavenging that nitrogen and building that grain protein.
And Matthew, is it something, the root structure, that you look at when you're developing your oilseed rape varieties?
Yeah, I mean, again, I agree with Kirsty. It's not an easy thing to actually do any selection in, and some academic institutions are developing quite nice techniques to actually do a bit more of that. I mean, I suspect that as breeders, we select inadvertently for good root structure in terms of bringing new products along that are performing better. The roots are obviously going to be part of that, particularly stability in terms of yield and so on. But it's obviously a big important thing in terms of where we're going with lower nitrogen levels, for example. We need to be able to pick up everything that's there. So I'm sure roots and the study of roots is going to be a much bigger part, a much more direct part of plant breeding in the future than maybe it was in the past.
And does that follow into your area, Antonia, when we're talking about sort of root crops, the sugar beets, the potatoes? I mean, they're roots in themselves, but in terms of how they interact with the soil and how best they, I suppose, harvest the nutrient that's available to them.
I think in terms of especially looking at sugar beet, the soil health and how the soil is actually prepared in the first instance, and having available nutrient to actually make sure that that the actual plant in itself can actually establish is pretty critical. And the same for potatoes too. It's all about the preparation of the soil and making sure that you've actually got enough for those roots to actually go down and not have compacted layers and all those things.
And it's and particularly in your field with sugar beet potatoes, you're moving a lot of that soil a lot of the time. It's even more of a challenge, isn't it, to make that perfect. It's easy for these guys growing cereals where they can just keep going over with a direct drill. You must look at them enviously because to make your stuff work, you've got to move a lot of soil.
But you've got to admit there are some pieces of research out there which I have actually looked at myself in previous roles, where you can look at how to grow some potatoes without all that soil shifting about. But there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment as to how to make a potato crop more sustainable, and sort of being part of the Sustainable Marketing Initiative last year was a very critical but very interesting point when it comes to actually trying to grow a crop like sugar beet or potatoes, because historically they don't have a good reputation on that front.
No, there's good. Tom Allen Stevens on the live chat, and don't forget, if you're watching this, you will see there is a chat box on your screen. Please dive in with any questions. Just send them in and put your name and what you're doing and where you're from. Tom, on the basis of following on our talk about root structure, he wants to know to the panel: is there any good tech that can measure root structure, or a way of measuring it easily in the field? Is there any sort of standardized tech out there at the moment, Kirsty, or is it all very much in its infancy?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, it is in its infancy. Yeah, I don't think we have a good system in cereals at the moment that everyone uses, and is sort of a benchmark, if you like. Everyone's developed their own particular way of looking at things, which is, actually that's what we need, isn't it? On a lot of new initiatives, we need to have that benchmark so everyone's measuring the same things in the same way.
Yeah, and there's nothing that you use, Matthew, when how you assess roots, or do you just sort of look at it the way you've always looked at it, or is there a standard format that you use when you're looking at root structure?
No, I mean it's very hard, even harder with oilseed rape for obvious reasons, because of the depth, the depth and the coverage of the roots. But as I mentioned before, there's some interesting things that academics are doing in terms of addressing this now. So it's sort of a bit of a watch this space, I think.
It sounds like there's some work to be done here to try and come up with some sort of smart root algorithm. Perhaps the world of AI will help us find the perfect cereal route. We have a question from Brian McCollum. Why do varieties become outclassed? Is it mainly breakdown to disease? New varieties are always better. 5% is not uncommon. Over 10 years, this might appear to represent a 50% increase in yield, but in reality, it isn't the case. Kirsty, why do varieties become outclassed?
I think they become outclassed for a number of reasons, actually. So I think, take a milling wheat, for example, you can find that obviously to produce a good milling wheat, it needs to perform very well at the end of the supply chain. And what we can find is that actually the sort of functionality, the build-up of the glutenins and gliadins that make the functionality of the protein can change over time, and certain varieties will lose their functionality. Others won't, but certain ones will. And obviously, so that clearly has an effect on why a variety would be grown for an end market. I think coupled with that, absolutely right, there is this problem with breeding really is all about making progress to stand still and then increase yield. We're constantly living in an environment that's changing all the time. It's very dynamic, as we we know. We only have to look at the last couple of seasons of weather to know how different the weather can be, and the stresses that are put on certain varieties, and certain will be better adapted than others. And really, plant breeding's aim is to adapt to the climate that you're in and add some kind of yield boost as well. And disease breakdown is clearly going to be important. I'm thinking particularly as an example, something like the septoria breakdown that happened when the cougar race broke down a couple of years ago. That clearly made a lot of varieties not very usable on farm because they suddenly become more susceptible to the disease and would need more chemistry applied to grow them effectively.
Matthew, is it similar challenges to oilseed rape in terms of what makes an oilseed rape variety become outdated? Is it because the quality of the oil changes, or it's superseded, or is it a combination of things?
It is a combination, and certainly the oil content has increased at a greater percentage than yield over the years. And obviously in oilseed rape we had hybrids coming in, which were quite a big jump, maybe if not in immediate yield terms, in terms of yield stability and yield reliability. But like all breeders, I have sort of occasionally thought, well, I wonder if this old variety is actually as bad and outclassed as we think it is. So I've occasionally put an old one of our old line varieties, for example, in trials just to see what would happen, and it is real that they are considerably worse than the modern varieties. You'd be glad to hear. So there's a real effect there, but it is a matter of having to keep up with environment becoming more and more hostile as the years go by, and by environment I obviously mean disease, pressure, and so on, as well as other changes, and obviously the climate problems we're now having. So it is something if breeders packed up tomorrow and said, all right, what you've got now is what you have to go on with, I think yields would drop very, very quickly. So it definitely needs to, we need to keep moving to stand still and then add a bit on top. So that's definitely the case.
And Antonia, in your field with root crops, presumably it's the same. You're constantly trying to strive forward, and things fall out of favour, again, because of quality of the product or the makeup of the finished product, be it the potato or the sugar content in the sugar beet. It's the same pressures apply, presumably, do they?
I think so. But also, just going back to looking at how diseases are, sort of mutate, actually breeding, a seed, be it a tuber or a wheat seed or a barley seed, to actually sort of withstand, a mutation of rust, for example, in cereals, but also again in blight. Blight in potatoes is a classic. We all know about, the various strains of blight that are emerging, and the speed that they actually, sort of mutate into. And so actually breeding something that will actually sort of do the job and actually stand up to, disease pressures like that is a massive challenge for any type of crop. So there could be a way where you could actually sort of look at sort of enhancing, a variety's performance by using, for example, the actual plant's own defences. You could actually look at maybe sort of even applying an elicitor to actually, sort of help boost that variety's, virulence is the wrong word, but vigor, that's it, vigor, looking for vigor.
Yeah.
And so improve the vigor of that and actually make sure that the plant actually grows away a bit more from the disease that's present in the crop. But yeah, it's a massive ask of any plant, I think, generally, because of the speed that diseases and strains mutate.
Yeah, no, it's it sounds like an ongoing challenge as everything, and the climate changes as well. Look, we on the chat, following on our discussion around root size of root structure and root structure, Anya Heathcote is a NIAB PhD student, and she's texted us and she's included her email to say, as a PhD student investigating the relationship between root structure and yield stability in UK wheat, I would be very happy to discuss my work with any interested parties. There you go. We may have found the perfect formula. We can start benchmarking all these wheat roots across the UK. Ralph Ferreira has a question. He says it might be slightly out of context in terms of today's presentation. It's back to basics, but he's basically saying, we can dance around the idea of genetics and traits and varietal traits and one thing and another. But at the end of the day, it comes back to basics. A complete soil analysis or soil health and nutrient availability is presumably key in any decision making. Matthew, would you say that's a sort of the no-brainer starting point, as it were?
I'd say absolutely, yeah. I mean, with the prices now of nitrogen and other fertilizers, to start to put it on without an idea of what you're dealing with in the first place would seem crazy. So yeah, that is absolutely correct.
And would you say you would agree with that, Antonia, in terms of with the work that you do?
Yes, absolutely. And I will revert back to a piece of work which is very close to my heart from a previous role at AHDB, and that was the Soil Rotations Partnership. Absolutely fantastic. They actually covered sugar beet and potatoes and other crops too. And so some of the PhDs that have actually put the work into that project, I urge everyone to actually sort of have a good proper look at that, because it doesn't just relate to beet and potatoes, but it is really quite something.
Across the board for all things in terms of getting it right.
Yeah. And in fact, there is actually a module in that where you can actually look at root mass, but it's actually for potatoes.
Only on potatoes. Oh no!
Sorry.
Kirsty, getting the basics right with the soil. I mean, it's a no-brainer, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I think absolutely it should be the focus. Getting the foundations right to build a healthy crop is clearly going to set you in the best light. Yes.
Charles Goldingham's just texted a question in, and he talks about the fact that whilst we're seeing wheat yields go up year on year, and roughly it's about 1% a year, they become more efficient one way or the other, deal it down to nutrient usage or yield. He said, is there an issue in the fact that micronutrient content within those crops is not going up at the catching up at the same time? Do we run the risk, Kirsty, of we're increasing yields, we're increasing the way the crops grow, but actually the end product, what's in the seed at the end of the day in terms of the nutrient content, is not keeping up? Is that a fair point, or is that happening?
I think that's a tricky one to answer, isn't it? Yes, because obviously we measure, I'm thinking protein is probably what he's thinking about top of mind. When you look at the recommended list, you can see some of the varieties that are in the 1 and 2 sector are on the list at less than 13%. So I kind of think that's where he's coming from, maybe. So yes, it is very difficult to feed a group 1 wheat, basically, with all of the right characteristics in there. We've obviously had the ones that are within the sector on the list for maybe 6 years, something like that, and they are becoming more difficult and more challenging to grow in terms of their, as we were saying in the previous question, they're becoming less competitive potentially on yield, and disease resistances are a challenge too for some. I think protein is a really interesting thing because protein is a measurement, obviously, and we have to have a measurement on which the whole system works on and on which, of course, the farmer would achieve a premium for. But actually, what we're really looking for is the functionality and the usability of that protein. And if there were a test that we could all use that measures the functionality rather than the level, I think we'd see actually that a lot of our varieties are very functional still and very usable in a range of products. So it's a tricky one because we're measuring a character protein, but we're actually slightly using the benefits of what that protein structure is delivering rather than the level of the protein when we're putting it into the final product. And we do know that final products are changing all the time. For example, the dreaded word salt is under the scrutiny again for bread making companies, and salt levels are going to be reduced again. And of course, the protein that is required to produce a loaf of bread will be very much under test and under pressure when salt is reduced, because it needs to create the right structure with a different recipe. So it's sorry, I've probably waffled on, given a complicated
It's a combination of things, you're right. And of course, the other debate
Yeah.
around the protein thing in wheat is when you're talking about, you're trying to get to net zero, you're trying to reduce your nitrogen input, and how important is it to have the protein where it is. It's a whole other debate. Matthew, presumably in oilseeds, I mean, we've seen a big increase, I suppose, in oil yield over the years. Has that, that increase in oil yield, has it diminished the quality of the oil?
No, I mean that hasn't really happened, but we do have some similarities with wheat, for example, in that there's been a lot of talk about home produced protein, and oilseed rape has been an idea as a crop to increase protein in. Obviously, the meal is already used, but if that could be enhanced in a way, that would be useful. But unfortunately, again, similarities with cereals. If you start selecting for high protein, you get lower and lower oil yield. So there's various, and you come certainly with oil. You also come up with physiological limits. I mean, if you imagine the seed is something like 45% oil anyway, if you get much higher than that, you end up with something that structurally doesn't actually work. So there are limits. But that doesn't mean there aren't ways potentially of increasing oil a bit more and bringing protein up, as long as we start concentrating on other things like canopy architecture, for example, that aren't actually giving you what's going through the combine and what's giving you your seed yield. If you can work on those other aspects, then there's a bit of room to play there, I think.
As a beef farmer, Matthew, I'd welcome if you could throw me a few more % on the protein and the rape meal at the same money. I'd be very appreciative of that. Antonia, how does it figure in the world of roots, this idea that increased yield diminishes the quality of the micronutrient and just the quality of the in your case the potato tubers or the sugar beet themselves?
Ooh. That's quite a tricky question to answer, to be honest with you, because obviously, sort of a potato and sugar beet, they are measured on their sugar content, and so you've got your starches in your potatoes, and then you've got obviously your sugar in sugar beet. So to be fair, I mean, looking at sort of micronutrients and the measurements of that in the actual product itself that's lifted out of the ground is not something that I know of that's actually been measured for, to be fair, but I'm sure somebody might, not that I've come across anyway.
So someone will text in and say they'll be doing a PhD on it. Look, please keep sending in your questions. Just enter it into the little text box on your screen. It would be be really good to hear your questions as we go along. We are now going to take a very quick break, and we're going to hear from our commercial sponsor friends at Frontier. And a very warm welcome to you back to our webinar. Big thank you to our commercial Frontier partners there, Frontier, for their contribution. So moving on with our questions with our panel. Lots of questions coming in now on the text. So please keep sending those in on the little chat box on your screen in front of you. Just put your name, what you're doing, and where you are, and your question, obviously. Philip Madeley has sent a question in from East Yorkshire. Following on from, we were talking about roots and trying to assess rooting or rooting ability, the size of roots and so on and so forth, and how that relates to yield and resilience. He was asking, could we breed plants that can uptake more or take more nutrients through their leaves? Now, I'm looking this year, we grow maize here on my farm. We're going to try out using a foliar feed for some of the nitrogen. Is that something that you're looking at, Kirsty, when you're developing your cereal varieties there at KWS?
So you mean foliar nitrogen applications specifically? Or,
yes, I think that's what he's getting at. Yeah, I think he's just generally looking at using the leaves as opposed to going through the roots, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, particularly that we do look at it, yes. Long and short of it, yes, we do look at how that influences how the plant develops in terms of its potential, and obviously if it's for an end use, the protein in that final product. I think there's always been a bit of discussion in the market about putting foliar nitrogen on at the later growth stages as a sort of protein boost, and there are definitely people within the marketplace buying wheat that do not want that. I think more millers are open to seeing the benefits of using a foliar N, and there is quite a bit of work going on looking at the relationship of different types of nitrogen applications at different stages using different types, and then looking at baking performance. So I think you might see a general shift in that understanding, but of course every end user has their specific requirements, so I would suggest that any grower always checks what the rules and regs are around the contract that they've signed up to.
Yeah, exactly. And Matthew, is it something? Because I mean, presumably, if you can put a nutrient on a leaf and it sticks there and it's not leaching through a soil, or not being that efficiently, if it's utilised more efficiently, stuck to a leaf, is that something that could help when you're growing oilseed rape? Do you think in the long term?
It's certainly foliar nitrogen has and is used. It has been and is used on oilseed rape. One of the issues is going back to something mentioned earlier. It does tend to boost protein and reduce oil, which is not good for growers' oil bonus. So that's
good for my beef cattle, Matthew.
Well,
if you could do that'd be good. Yeah,
particularly if you're getting it for free. But that's
exactly.
But yeah, it certainly has its place, I think, in terms of nutrients other than nitrogen. So yeah.
I was going to say, Antonia, because P's and K's, trying to get them into plant and avoid going through the soil. If you could put them straight on the leaves of potatoes or sugar beet, that would be a far more efficient way than having to sort of put them on the soil and then, like I say, they get lost. Not all of the uptake efficiency is compromised, isn't it, compared with putting it on a leaf? Is that something that's happening in your field at all?
Pretty much so, yes. But obviously, UPL are number one in the world for natural plant protection sort of products, and also sort of biostimulants, bioprotectants, all those things. So not necessarily dealing with like foliar, sort of nitrogen, but for example, foliar applied sulfur in a product, such as thioprom, is something that we are actively sort of looking at and doing the research on to actually promote sort of how it improves the end product, for example, in potatoes and sugar beet. And obviously with biostimulants, they are generally foliar applied. So for sugar beet, for example, we'd be looking at Vital Root or something like Ariamin, which is something that will help go into the plant and actually produce a better root. And there's substantial data to actually prove that. Yeah.
So there's room there for it. Just following on from our micronutrients conversation, Ron Granger from Lima Grain says that our papers to suggest that modern varieties have the same or even better regarding nutrient profiles than historic varieties. So Charles Goldingham, I hope that goes some way to helping answer your question. One question that's come in, Paul Harris, and he's interested in, well, basically, what's the panel's view, the difference between liquid fertilizer versus solid fertilizer? Kirsty, is that something you take into account when you're developing varieties, or do you just use one form or the other?
Yeah, no, I would say that is something that maybe in the past we didn't look at in such great detail, but clearly, you know, we are focusing on that now. Again, it comes back to the numbers game, so it's not necessarily about when we're developing varieties that are in the 13-year pipeline. It's more about the products that come out the other end and finding out how to get the best out of them, which forms of fertilizer to use, be they obviously new green fertilizers, liquid fertilizers or solid fertilizers, and really looking at the end performance of the variety, having had those different applications at different rates, different timings. So yes, we are investigating that more and more.
I was going to say, because presumably in terms of trying to, with on the sort of net zero journey and reducing carbon footprint, we know that, you know, bagged fertilizer is one of the biggest chunks of that carbon equation. So can you see us, Kirsty, ending up with some sort of nitrogen utilization metric attached to varieties? I mean, it'd be great if we had a standard across the board, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that, yeah, it would be amazing if we could have that for a lot of metrics, actually, I have to say. Yes, I mean, it's what we measure when we measure it. I think it comes back to that. And as soon as we have a baseline which people agree with across the board and across the industry of what we're measuring, yeah, I could see there is a place for any new metric to be measured. And knowing what you're doing and having attention to detail is by far the most important thing that I think we can all do on this journey to net zero.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Matthew, do you notice any difference between liquid and solid fertilizers, and when on the trial work you've done, particularly around oilseed rape?
It's sort of, to me, it's a wider question and opportunity, in that the digital revolution is going to allow us to design varieties for specific situations, because it will allow us not just to look at plant breeding, but be able to put lots of different data together and make sure the right variety is in the right place. And where we have gaps in variety portfolios, we'll be able to fill those. So it's just one more example of something, a variable at the moment, that we will be able to put into the equation in the future and be plant breeding not only oilseed rape but other crops to actually better fit the situations they're used in. And I think that's quite exciting for the future.
And Antonia, do you have a view on liquid versus solid fertilizer? I mean, your experience around, say, potatoes. I think, you know, some people are very wedded to one or the other. Do you see any great differences?
To be honest with you, it depends on the season, because potatoes are one of those crops where, you know, it's you know, if we could actually kind of have a drought resistant, you know, sort of potato, or drought resistant, you know, sort of sugar beet variety. I mean, I think there's some work going on already on that. But to be fair, when it comes to foliar applied fertilizers, I actually am a big fan for those crops in particular, definitely. But there's also benefits to be had with soil applied as well, you know, for, you know, especially in potatoes, you know, because you've got to establish the crop first. So tough enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's horses for courses, isn't it? Nigel Hester has sent a comment in saying, with regards talking about foliar supply, he said it's not possible to supply sufficient NPK or S for most crops via the leaf, but foliar nutrition can complement a soil applied program. Measure it and manage it. Not surprisingly, those of you who know Nigel know that he comes from a fertilizer company. So, but it's a good point. Thank you, Nigel, for your contribution. Kirsty Richards, are you concerned at all about the lack of quality Group 1 milling wheat coming through the development pipeline? Is it something we should be concerned about? And this is a question from Will Sanderson, and it's a question that, you hear people talk about quite a lot at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we spoke a little bit earlier, didn't we, about the fact that the current Group 1 milling wheats on the list have been, well, the last one I think that was added was possibly Illustrious, maybe our own Zayat around 2016. Yeah, of course it's a concern, but it's not for the want of trying. Just to be absolutely clear, all breeders are aiming for that Group 1 potential. I think we set the bar quite high when we introduced varieties like Skyfall and Zayat onto the list, because the yield potential of the varieties was up with the protein functionality. And obviously, to be on the list, the variety has to, well, it usually has to be in a better increase in yield than what's already there. So, it's a real challenge. We're basically looking for varieties that, if you draw a line and look at yield and protein, they sit way above the line, so they have good protein and good yield, and they're hard to find. I think it's also worth pointing out a bit of what we spoke about before, that the products that these wheats are being used for in the end use camp now are different to the products that were being produced 10 years ago. So, we're trying to, everything is a movable feast. We're trying to get the yield right, we're trying to get the disease profile right, we're trying to get the protein right, and we're trying to fit into a recipe that's changed over the years. And we've mentioned a little bit about salt reduction. That's the next challenge, getting the proteins to function with different recipes. So I'd like to reassure Will that we are very much looking, as are all the other breeders. I think if I look back into the official trials, something like 20 or 30 varieties have been entered into NL2 this year with all good bread making potential, and the UK flour millers will look at those and kind of tell us who's found the lucky one, if there is one in there.
Who's hit the jackpot? Matthew, is there a... Yeah, well, it is, I suppose, if you spent 13 years developing it and you get to the very end. Matthew, is there a good, I suppose, gene pool coming forward in the world of oilseed rape, or is that equally as constrained as we see with milling wheat?
Well, oilseed rape is as we all know, is a fairly new crop that didn't really exist as a large commercial crop in the lifetime of probably many of us on the call. So there's a lot of work still to be done, for example, in oilseed rape, in developing the different pools for hybrid breeding, for example. So much oilseed rape is still a very indeterminate crop. I mean, it's not gone through the same stages so far in terms of canopy development and so on that many of our other crops have done. So there's a lot to be done there. But just on the as a non cereal expert on the Group 1 question, I suspect this takes us almost back to the first discussions on gene editing, because this would seem to me to be just a sort of thing where you could tweak something and have a high yielding wheat from another background that you can maybe turn into a Group 1 easier than you could have done by conventional breeding. But
spin some magic. Yeah. Is that possible, Kirsty, do you think?
Well, I'd love to think it was. Yeah, I think it's also important to sort of acknowledge that at the moment we can do lots of predictions in terms of protein levels and how the protein is made up, but we can't really tell how good a bread making wheat is until we bake a loaf. And obviously you need a certain amount of grain to do that. So you're doing it fairly late in the breeding, later on in the breeding cycle. So I think if we could find absolutely, Matthew, if you could find a technology that you could look for specific traits and follow those through, or if you could find a test that you could do earlier on in the breeding cycle where you're finding varieties that have spread making potential earlier on, then I think, you know, our sort of chances would be much increased.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's another metric that's needed, another application of AI. We end the shopping list is endless here. I hope all the PhDs that are tuned in are making note, because there's fortunes to be made on this. Antonia, a varietal or genetic variation, genetic abundance, is that something that's a constraint when you're doing your plant breeding on root crops? Or is it as constrained as the others, or have you got plenty of variety out there? Is there a big enough gene pool?
Ooh. Unfortunately, this tends to actually sort of go back down the route of that political question as to, who buys what and where. Because, sort of varieties are known and loved, and everybody loves a Mary Piper. We don't, because it's full of disease. We hate it. But unfortunately, people still grow it because they love it. And so this is a question almost for for going back to the origins of the original potato, and having been lucky enough to go to Scotland last year and look at the Commonwealth sort of varieties database, which is fabulous. If you ever get to go, because in there you have got the perfect answer to all our problems. They are resistant to aphids. They are resistant to blight. There's all sorts of things that the original wild potato is perfectly very good at doing. However, trying to translate that into something that's purchasable, and consumable, more to the point. So we're going down those looks, the taste, the skin finish, the end use, all of that stuff. It's a massive question. I could go on for hours on this.
It sounds like so what you're saying, there are some perfect potatoes out there, but they're horrible. They're a horrible colour, very ugly and gnarly, and they yield nothing. They yield, they're just revolting looking. Yeah, no, it's a challenge, isn't it? Caroline Corsi, just on this, Kirsty, she asks, are heritage wheat genes involved at all in varietal diversity? Is there any throwback to comparing stuff of old with stuff of new, or do we just keep marching forward?
Yeah, no, I think there's always an opportunity, isn't there? So, I mean, the goal of the wheat breeder particularly is to, well, any breeder really, is to obviously have as much genetic diversity in his crossing program, so that the right variety can be selected as you move through, and the sort of environment that we're operating in changes. So yes, I'm sure there is a place for certain heritage varieties, and I'm sure breeding companies have them within their portfolio. I think also, it's not just about looking at UK source material, it's about looking further afield around the world and looking at what characteristics are popular and useful in other parts of the world that could be perhaps put into a UK plant type, if you like, and used in that environment. So, I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, it is there. Now let's move on to a question from Paul Flynn. And he says that assuming all the benefits of varietal traits were in place, what percentage reduction would the panel expect to see in the carbon footprint of a typical arable farm? I ask the question because the benefit may only be quite modest, and I'm not sure that as an industry we fully appreciate the scale of the challenge to reach net zero. So we've let the net zero cat out of the proverbial net zero cat bag. Antonia, let's start. How do you perceive, trying to get to net zero with potatoes and with root crops? That's not easy, is it?
No, it's not. However, there is a possibility where if you actually look at the whole picture, the whole wider picture of growing a sugar beet crop, for example, or potatoes, looking at you're going to love me for the AI thing again, because there's ways and means of dealing with this, because once we've actually sort of worked out sort of how we can actually reduce our water use, how we can reduce our inputs, what disease levels are in there, all those things, factor that in, sort of using, sort of natural plant protection where possible to actually sort of enhance that reduction in sort of inputs, sort of traveling across less if necessary. That's going to be hard when it comes to sort of weed control and sugar beet in the first instances. But, there's ways and means of doing that. And if you then look at sort of like boosting a plant's, sort of protection naturally inside the plant, that actually in turn will actually sort of help that plant sort of grow better and actually also reduce inputs, because hopefully you won't actually have to put so much ag chem on or so much fert, so more tractor passes, all of that, so there's that AI thing that is actually quite a fundamental part of actually growing a root crop. And it's a big ask, but having worked on a number of projects over the last few years on this, there's ways and means. It's never going to be totally net zero. That, it won't. But a reduction.
Do you think, so Kirsty, are we going to get a totally net zero wheat crop?
Well, wouldn't that be a thing? It's a tricky thing, isn't it?
I mean, presumably with the wheat thing, I mean, we can obviously balance the net zero off if we've got an arable farm and we're doing a load of, we've got, I don't know, let's say we've got carbon depleted soil and we're doing loads of cover crop in rotation to offset.
Yeah.
But but presumably for wheat, it's all about the nitrogen, isn't it? It's that holy grail of wheat that grows in fresh air.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think it goes back to what we were saying, and by understanding more about nitrogen use efficiency, all these things are going to be really important. But I would love to say I could think of a net zero wheat crop. Maybe I'm being naive, but I can't see it.
Yeah, it's challenging. And Matthew, again, with oilseed rape, presumably that's back to the nitrogen question as well.
It is really, yeah, and I'm certainly not going to put a figure on this, but I think we can only think in terms of lots and lots of incremental gains, and as we're getting more and more efficient in terms of where we're applying treatments and fertilizers, for example, and as we're targeting varieties to fit those efficient systems, possibly even things like more than one variety on a field, for example, according to soil changes and historic yields and that sort of thing. As we put all this data together in practical terms on farms, we're making more and more of these incremental gains, so we can at least get to be as good as we can be. But obviously, net zero is a movable target anyway.
Well, it is. It's very movable.
Do you view it as something over the entire farm or over the entire cycle of plough to fork or whatever? It's not an easy thing to measure.
No, it's not. I mean, Kirsty, on the wheat front, we're always told that wheat, for the last 20 years, wheat's done 1%. It's become 1% more efficient each year, whether that's down to better nitrogen utilization or yield, better yield. I mean, can we sort of bank on that 1%, or do you think that might run into trouble, or could we go for 2% or 5%?
What is it in terms of yield potential? Did you mean? Sorry, Hugh.
In terms of, there's a figure, one of the NIAB people the other year, I remember at Cereals telling me for the podcast that if you look at UK wheat efficiency over the last 20 years, it has on average done 1% a year in terms of, and that could be either through yield increase or nitrogen utilization increase. So can we bank on that 1%, or do you think we could even go higher as we get better at things, whether it's using AI or gene editing or just getting better at what we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I see what you mean. Yeah, so I think, obviously it's always a challenge, isn't it? But I think that is the aim of breeding, is to keep moving forward. There are different techniques available and new ones that will become available. I mean, hybridization, it could be an answer as well, being more productive over the same amount of area of land. Obviously, there are limited examples of hybrid wheat particularly working in the UK at the moment, but I'm sure that's something that many breeders are looking at for the future.
Yeah, no, it's one of those holy grail questions, is it? And at the moment, we're sort of trying to get the most efficient in terms of output and doing the offsetting to get us to where we think we need to be with the net zero. A theme of a few questions that have been coming in is this issue around plant protection products and the availability of, or the array or the variety of plant protection products. That diversity, shall we say, in the market is very different to where it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. Matthew Clark, do you see that as I mean, it's a big challenge going forward, isn't it?
It's definitely a big challenge going forward, and it does mean that breeders have got to be on the ball in bringing new resistances in, and those resistances need to often come from related species, for example, so take quite a lot of effort to bring in, unless again we're talking about possible uses of gene editing there. So there's a lot for breeders to do, but there's also the products themselves, at least in my view, are likely to change and move into ones that can be classed as more biological products. And again, there's space there for breeding programs to align themselves with particular products in order to make the most of both the variety and the product. So I think we'll see more of this.
And do you see it as a big challenge, Kirsty, going forward?
Yeah, I think, as you rightly said, Hugh, it is a big challenge. We've obviously seen in wheat, an example would be obviously our loss of chlorothalonil in the last couple of years, which was the underpinning benchmark really for septoria control in wheat. So, that changes the way that people use varieties. Obviously, breeders are constantly looking for more robust varieties with better disease resistances, and then coupling that with the chemistry, the best chemistry that's available to give a really sort of resilient package. But I think also as breeders, we're doing all of that anyway, but we're also looking at other applications, a bit like Matthew said, with things like biologicals or different types of products that can actually increase the resilience of the plant itself to fight disease and so forth. So there is a lot of work going on. We're not sort of, as breeders, I feel we're not waiting for chemistry to drop off the shelf. We're hoping to work in partnership with what is there and what's coming through to give the best sort of most resilient plant for the farmer.
Forging forward, and like you say, it's trying to find that perfect utopian nutrition to get the best out of the plant. Do you get, Antonia? Is the plant protection product availability, is that an issue when it comes to sugar beet and potatoes, and when you're thinking about what you're breeding forward, and obviously the disease threat? So it's having that crystal ball, isn't it? What is the disease threat going to be in 5 years' time? Oh, and what will we be able to treat it with? Ants or syrup or whatever?
Well, innovation is a great thing. It's one of my favourite subjects. But the thing is, what you've got to remember is, so biologicals, sort of are coming to the forefront there, and purely, obviously, with a company like UPL, we are really, really proud of what we've achieved so far. So, for example, if you look at, I'll go to wheat for a second. So if you look at a wheat crop, a standard variety, and then you apply a biological product, be it in a seed treatment, or be it, a product like laminarin, some iodas, these are biological products. Now, with the loss of CTL, what's the replacement? Well, you could actually got a really good placement, within a conventional crop protection program, where you can actually put in a biological to enhance that plant's performance, and that's what laminarin does. And that basically boosts its natural defenses against disease. Then later on in the program, you've actually got, a T1 and T2, and sort of application where you could maybe use something like sulfur, and that again can actually boost, against sort of fungicidal, sort of diseases, and for example, control of septoria. So, there's definitely a growing need and appetite for biologicals to be part of the breeding program. So, looking at biological, sort of seed treatments is something, especially in potatoes. Potatoes, is definitely something that can be looked at and is being looked at. It is a niche market. There's not very much out there at the moment, but again, these can actually sort of help, sort of establish a crop and actually sort of enhance yield. And there's data to prove that. Same with laminarin, sort of looking at that in other crops such as pulses or sugar beet, for example. There's pieces of work going on, sort of on that may help, to give that plant the best opportunity to enhance its breeding characteristics and produce better yield at the same time. So
it's back to the ultimate holy grail of perfect nutrition, isn't it? And it's look, the same thing's happening within the farm animal context. It's the same thing. Rupert Knowles has sent a question on the text. Kirsty, are there varieties being developed that are particularly suited to regenerative agriculture systems? So is that something now that we think about in terms of, is this wheat better in a direct drill or on a different driller?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we've and other breeders are playing around with all the time, actually. So from our own perspective at KWS, when varieties get quite close to the marketplace, we tend to try and look at them in a direct drill situation and conventionally ploughed situation too, and see how those varieties perform. We can see a pattern, and we can see the types of varieties that tend to do better. But what we have seen is quite a lot of variability across seasons. And I have to admit that from a trials perspective, I don't think we quite have the right kit to really be able to do it justice at the moment. So I think what would be really nice looking into the future was if poor HGB, they have so much to do anyway, but I mean, if you could have a standardized technique or something where you're comparing all of the varieties within a well-run direct drill situation rather than letting individual companies sort of tell you information, I think that would be quite a useful addition to the RL, but clearly that would cost an awful lot of money and time and effort, so I'm not sure whether that would be high up on the agenda, but I think yes, it's certainly something that when I first started at KWS we would never even have looked at, but now we are definitely investigating it more and looking for what plant types are more usable in a direct drill situation.
And presumably there's a bit of backward thinking in a nice way, in the sense that if you're in a sort of direct drill situation, so you're running at a lower cost model, so you'll accept a lower yield. So it's almost like, well, we could just tweak backwards a bit, and you could have a more robust, hardier wheat that perhaps doesn't yield as much, but it's just a bit tougher. I mean, is that a fair argument?
Yeah, I mean, those wheats are around, aren't they? They are sort of available. They sort of more vigorous types, more stronger types, stiffer strawed, all the rest of it as they develop through the season. But what we're seeing is there's a definite type of variety that seems to do well, but we're finding it difficult really because of the trials equipment that we have access to and the locations really to replicate that year on year. So we need to perhaps improve the way that we're looking at it in our own trial to really come out with some definite rules of thumb, I think.
Yeah, Matthew, is it something? I mean, presumably it's something that comes in to oilseed rape. Do you test that or look at that, the oilseed rape's ability? I mean, the obvious thing is, is there any difference between this variety and that variety when it comes to, for example, resilience to flea beetle? But do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly does seem to be differences between varieties in that respect, and we also, I mean, a lot of oilseed rape, including field trials, is established by direct drilling now. So we do have some ability to compare direct drilling with traditional cultivation. So we can bring some variety selection to play with that. But I think increasingly we're getting to the point where we can actually go back into the genetics and say, look, this particular profile tends to work very well in this particular set of circumstances. So we can start almost from the beginning and start designing varieties for the situation we're looking for, rather than just saying, oh, here we've got a load of varieties at the end stage, let's see which works the best. It's coming much more into design, and I'm sure that's not just an oilseed rape thing. That'll be across crops and breeding programs.
Yeah, no, it's triggering. Antonia, there's obviously there's not a huge amount of opportunity for direct drilling in the world of sugar beet and potatoes, but I'm sure it's. But I mean, look, you're constantly thinking of the environmental impact of your crop and making it more efficient as you go forward.
Well, absolutely, but also just going back to the varietal choices as well. In both beet and also potatoes. In sugar beet now, you've also got, sort of specific varieties which have been bred to be resistant to, sort of SUs, so SU tolerant. So you have got those options already, sort of available. In potatoes, not so fortunate. But there's definitely room for sort of improvement. But again, in the potatoes route, it is more down to market use, what it looks like, who's going to buy it, why they won't buy it, all those things.
Yes, the basics of it is. Look, I think one thing we have established here, guys, tonight is there is definitely some room in the market for some serious metrics, whether we're talking about root size, whether we're talking about its resilience or its a vigor in a direct drill situation. Now, whether that's invested in collectively, or look, we could have a wonderful PhD on the call that's going to email you like we had earlier with all the answers, and we're all there. But there's still a lot of work to do, isn't there, going forward on all of those things? But look, you've given us a fantastic insight into all the stuff that's going on, all the factors that affect varietal choice at the point of before you start drilling the crop. And it's been really, really useful. Dr. Kirsty Richards on the Eurovision scoreline, who isn't with us in Vision, thank you very much for your time. Antonia Walker, thank you very much for joining us tonight from UPL. And Matthew Clark, esteemed oilseed rape breeder from Bayer, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's been a really useful session. This webinar will be, by the magic of technology, it will be turned into a podcast that you can listen to the whole thing again whilst you're trying to calibrate your seed drill or set up the sprayer, assuming the weather actually gives us some windows in the next week or two, or indeed you can tell all your friends about it. And they'll be able to find that on the Farmers Weekly podcast channel. It'll be released in the next day or two. I'd also like to take a time to big thank you to our commercial sponsor Frontier tonight as well, without whom this would not be possible. Thank you very much, Frontier, for sponsoring. It is great to have you guys along as well. Don't forget, there will be more transition webinars coming up, so keep an eye on the Farmers Weekly, keep an eye on your emails, and on the transition part of the Farmers Weekly website, because there will be another transition webinar coming up next month. But in the meantime, from me, Hugh Broom, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Do enjoy the rest of your Thursday night, and until next time, goodbye.